Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the third weekend of February 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric street news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news. Today, we'll discuss the FEMA officials who were fired as DOGE continues to examine government spending and activities. We'll hear more about the alleged leak of an immigration enforcement operation from the FBI to the media, and we'll look at President Trump's latest tariffs and energy policies. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With the latest on DOGE, it's our Dan McCaleb.
The new Department of Government Efficiency has been a hit with many, though not all, Americans, as seemingly every day the group that Elon Musk leads finds new evidence of questionable federal spending. The latest shocking example found this week has led to firings and a drawback of millions of dollars. DOGE this week reported that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, the agency whose priority is to respond to natural disasters and help victims with relief, spent millions of dollars on New York hotels to house immigrants in the U.S. illegally, including members of the violent Venezuelan prison gang, Tren de Aragua. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, at least 4 FEMA officials were fired over the revelation, and new Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem was blunt when she said she was drawing back the money. Tell us more.
Well, I mean, I think the takeaway here, Dan, is you've been saving up for your vacation when all along you should have just been trying to get picked up by DHS, and you would have been put in a cushy New York City hotel somewhere. Maybe, I don't know if room service was included. But of course, I'm joking a little bit, but not a lot, because that is really the impression that we're getting from this. The latest example of federal funding run amok, your taxpayer dollars being sloshed and handed out and doled out in ways that raise eyebrows and are starting to anger people, I think. And this latest example that Kristi Noem has really cracked down on, we see that these are not, this is not the Motel 6, Dan. This is not the Super 8. It's not even the Holiday Inn. These are some luxury hotels that illegal immigrants, migrants are being put in. And if there's anything, if there's anything the government does, it's move slowly. And so these are not overnight stays. These are extended stays as the government gets its act together, processes people. And it's really a sign of just how overwhelmed the system is. Of course, hotels and luxury hotels are not the first choice for housing migrants, but because the illegal immigration crisis got so out of control during the Biden administration, they ran out of places to put people. They don't really value the money that much. They don't see it as their own. And so they started putting people, these migrants, in these luxury hotels. And so Elon is uncovering it. He's uncovered all kinds of things. This is just one example. Of course, this is particularly salient because Laken Riley's killer is involved, and Laken Riley has really become a symbol of the danger that it posed to American citizens when you let millions and millions of people into the U.S. not knowing who they are, what their criminal backgrounds are. And even when you do arrest them, sometimes they get out. not deporting people. Just the whole brokenness of the system is really culminating in this very stark example of government waste and immigration dysfunction.
Laken Riley, of course, the late Georgia college student who was killed by an illegal immigrant while she was jogging near campus. Casey, Kristi Noem on X yesterday, after the revelations that this federal taxpayer money was being spent to house migrants in the U.S. illegally at this posh New York hotel. I'm just going to read her quote on X. "I have clawed back the full payment that FEMA deep state activists unilaterally gave to New York City migrant hotels. FEMA was funding the Roosevelt Hotel that serves as a Tren de Aragua base of operation and was used to house Laken Riley's killer. Mark my words, there will not be a single penny spent that goes against the interest and safety of the American people." That's pretty blunt.
It is pretty blunt, but it just shows you, I mean, where there's this example, how much more is going on, Dan, that we don't know about. I mean, if you find a bottle of alcohol in your teenager's room, and you take that bottle and you throw it away, you don't say, "Oh, we've solved the problem." No, you assume this has been going on for a while and there's a lot more where that came from. And this is the same thing. I mean, I'm glad that we found this example. We cleaned it up. The government now seems intent on, preventing future spending of this kind. But how are they even going to know? I mean, the government is so massive, as Musk has continued to point out. There are so many, actually millions of employees who are doing things at different levels and no accountability. The IGs release these reports that no one reads, and they're not very thorough, and they're often too nice, and nothing changes. It's basically almost impossible to fire these people. I mean, we're starting to see some firings, some buyouts. But I think the question that I'm asking, and I think some Americans are asking, is this just a fad, Dan, where we're going to pretend to crack down on government waste for a couple of months and make an example out of some of the worst things? Or are we going to have a multi-year systemic overhaul, reformation of how the government does business, the accountability, the ability to fire people, shrinking the overall size of government, shrinking the responsibilities, and them not doing things they shouldn't be doing? Are we going to have a total reformation, or is this just a fad? I think that's my question.
Yeah, and many Democrats have pushed back on all of these cuts that Trump has announced, that Musk has found. But Trump did double down again this week when he signed an executive order requiring federal agencies to work with Musk DOGE. Tell us about that.
So this, Trump has issued a flurry of executive orders since taking office, some of them relating to federal spending, DOGE, which Musk is leading, as we've said. This one in particular gives DOGE some more specific legal authority. There's been some questions about, hey, what is DOGE anyway? And do we really have to report to these, basically teenagers or young kids that Musk, this little ragtag bunch of, 20-year-olds that are 25-year-olds that are helping Musk do these things? And now the answer legally is, yeah, you do. you career bureaucrats who are balking at working with Musk and his team. Yes, you do have to work with them. The order also put in place some restrictions around hiring, that basically agencies cannot just go and replace these people who are being fired. I think the order said they can hire one person for every 4 that are fired. This is really just laying a legal groundwork and framework moving forward, because we have not yet seen the mass firings that some in the DOGE community promised. We've seen buyouts, we've seen some firings, but for instance, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's no longer part of DOGE, but used to help lead it. I mean, he was talking about going alphabetically and basically firing every other person in the government. And so it's going to be really interesting to see if we ever get there. This order is going to provide some legal groundwork where these agencies can't just go hire a bunch of people back and replace them. And of course, there's big freezes on hiring now, and a lot of agencies don't even know their budget or what's going to happen moving forward. There's kind of a limbo in the federal government. So this order requires them to work with DOGE. He's going line by line. Of course, he started with USAID, and we saw what happened there. I mean, most of that agency is basically gone now. It's all but destroyed. And the examples coming out of USAID, of course, there are good things that USAID has done, but the examples coming out of it of what they've done badly have just really discredited that agency in a lot of ways. and given Musk sort of the moral impetus, the moral imperative to keep going, to keep finding examples like these, like the luxury hotels that we're talking about, like the transgender operas overseas. There's so many examples like this that I think Musk and Trump still have the backing of the American people to go after this thing.
Now, a lot of these spending cuts are going to be going through the court system, as 22 states attorney generals filed suit against the Trump administration to block cuts to the National Institute of Health's grants that go to pay for administrative costs. Democrats say, that's going to hurt healthcare research. Trump says that's just going to delay the federal government from easing the debt burden and the deficit burden on the budget. Final comments, Casey.
Yeah, they're kind of undercutting each other. In one sense, Trump's talks about the budget ring a little bit hollow when he's pushing the sizable tax cuts that he is now. Lower taxes are generally popular among Americans and Republicans, but pushing them at the same time that you're talking about spending cuts, and those spending cuts don't make up for all the tax cuts you're pushing, I think it weakens his argument a little bit. But Democrats are in an even bigger pickle because Trump has such a mandate. If they oppose Trump right now, it's almost like they're opposing the recently elected president and really the will of the people by proxy. And they're not unified. They're not uniform in their messaging, their argument. They're complaining about the process, which is never a good place to be. And they don't have any kind of philosophical unity or moral fiber to their push. They're just complaining about the way Trump is doing things. And that is not enough to stand up to this Trump train, which is going 180 miles an hour right now, Dan.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the details of an immigration enforcement operation that were allegedly leaked from the FBI to the media, it's our Eliana Kernodle.
Border Czar Tom Homan says information indicates the FBI may have leaked details of an immigration enforcement operation to the media, thereby, quote, putting officers at risk, unquote. He says the U.S. Department of Justice has opened a criminal investigation into the matter and may criminally prosecute the responsible individuals. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, tell us about what Tom Homan had to say.
Hey, Eliana. Just to clarify, this is about individuals at the FBI, not the FBI as a whole, but that there are people at the FBI or a single person who may appear to have been leaking information to the press about raids for targeting violent criminals mostly. That is the target of Homan's efforts at this time. He has went on television to say that the Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office, is conducting an investigation and will criminally prosecute people who are leaking operational information to the media about these raids. He said that this individual or individuals will lose their job, will lose their pension, and will even possibly face time in jail because he says that there's possibility of ambush, that lives are being put at risk, but also that they're just not going to be able to get the people who they are targeting.
What details did the Los Angeles Times publish in their report that sort of brought about this allegation of a leak in the FBI?
Well, they did report when a large operation was planned for, which does allow people to know when it's time to stay low. At this stage, I do believe that the administration has shared that it is only targeting certain violent individuals who have committed felonies and serious crimes. So this does allow people who are criminals to avoid being caught. There are other instances where this has happened, though.
Yeah, this isn't the first time questions have been raised about a leak. What other examples have we seen?
Yeah, there was a operation in Aurora, Colorado. That's where during the campaign season, we saw that there were gangs who had taken over apartment buildings. These were people in the country illegally who were extorting people and committing acts of violence. And there was a leak about the operation in this area before it happened. And as a result, they were not able to apprehend many of these criminals.
Notably, any of these efforts, any of these enforcement operations will take place without cooperation from Los Angeles and other local law enforcement because of sanctuary laws in the state. Can you get into that conversation?
Yeah, so California broadly has a sanctuary state law that prevents enforcement or in cooperation with federal immigration enforcement authorities. They are able to relay information for people who are convicted of serious or violent felonies. That is a very short list of crimes that excludes a lot of violent and or serious felonies, such as a felony conviction of domestic violence. So there is a little controversy over whether or not that's an inclusive enough list. The city of Los Angeles itself also has its own sanctuary policies. But by not cooperating or sharing information with federal officials, they are pretty much saying that this is a population that they're going to take care of. It has been admitted by LA city council members that, maybe 1 in 10 city residents is undocumented.
What new legislation is being considered around this conversation?
Well, we have in California, there was a bill that was passed by the legislature and is on its way to the governor's desk that would prohibit state prisons from working with ICE. As I said earlier, serious and violent convicted felons, they can be deported with cooperation with ICE under the current sanctuary laws, because people generally agree that those are very serious or violent crimes that someone should get deported for. This bill would have stopped cooperation with the state prisons with ICE and significantly reduced deportations of those individuals.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on President Trump's latest tariffs and energy policy. It's Dan Michaela.
Inflation was elevated again in January, leading to new concerns about the cost of goods for consumers. President Donald Trump continues to announce new tariffs on imported goods, something some economists think will lead to even more inflation. But there's also optimism that Trump's energy policies, essentially drill baby drill, will lead to lower energy costs at some point in the future. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square. Casey, Trump has been moving at breakneck pace, which is leading to some uncertainty about the economy. Let's start with energy prices. You interviewed the executive director of Power the Future, an energy workers advocacy group, this week. What did he say about Trump's policies and the price of energy going forward?
That's right. I spoke to Daniel Turner, executive director of Power the Future. My takeaway, Dan, is, of course, we are in a lot of economic uncertainty, but if there's anything we can be certain about, it's that Trump is going to open up domestic drilling, which is going to help lower energy prices and gas prices as well. Now, it's complicated by his tariffs, but, Daniel Turner was explaining to me that it's not just the drilling that affects the energy prices. For instance, there's really a delay in how long it takes oil to get to market. And so actually the oil that we are consuming now was drilled years ago. And so it's really the prices, there's lagging indicators here. And so I think there has to be a little bit of patience when we expect these prices to come down. But what we do have is when energy companies can predict that the regulatory framework is going to be favorable, when there's not going to be a bunch of new regulations, then they lower their prices in anticipation of that. Also, when it's easier and cheaper for them to get capital because of lower regulations and to get leases, then that can also lower the prices more quickly. Now, so I think we will see and on that end, we will see lower energy prices because of the less regulatory environment under the Trump administration. With that being said, if these tariffs do kick in, particularly on Canada, that could really complicate things because we import a lot of energy from Canada, oil and different things. And so Of course, those tariffs have been delayed right now. Many say that Trump is just using them as a bargaining chip to pressure Canada and Mexico and doesn't actually plan to have long-term tariffs with those countries. We do have trade deals with them already. And so that's an interesting thing. I mean, so far that's really proven true. We have not instituted those tariffs and therefore not seen the higher prices that would come as a result of them. And, Trump has gotten some concessions from both Canada and Mexico. Trump's critics will say the concessions weren't very good, but they have been used as a bargaining chip. And we have a few more weeks here before we really see if it continues to be a bargaining chip, if the can gets kicked down the road on these tariffs, or if they're actually going to become reality. Trump has indicated that he plans to use reciprocal tariffs, where he works with these countries to put tariffs on them, other countries around the world, to raise revenue for the U.S. And he's very bullish. He's very optimistic that he can raise a lot of money with these tariffs and bring us into a new golden age where we can lower other taxes. To your point about uncertainty, Dan, before I hand it back to you, there's a lot of projections, a lot of predictions, a lot of speculations about what these tariffs can and cannot do, but we really have no idea because we have not had, widespread tariffs in the U.S. for over 100 years. There's a lot of externalities. There's a lot of unintended consequences, how the market will react, how other countries will react, what Trump is able to get in these negotiations and trade deals that could offset some of the higher prices for Americans. It's uncharted territory, a lot of uncertainty, and we haven't seen anything like it in 100 years. So, hey, Dan, all the more reason to keep listening to this podcast to stay in touch, right?
That's right, Casey. You wrote this week that inflation in January ticked up again. Consumer prices were up 0.5% in January for 12 months. Over the past year, that was 3% inflation. The Federal Reserve likes inflation to be closer to 2%. So that does complicate the Fed's plans to lower interest costs, which went up significantly during in 2022, 2023, during the height of inflation under the Biden administration. What's going on there?
Yeah, but so we are seeing a little bit rise of inflation. We're up to 3%, which is, I think it is a rise. It is notable. To put it in context, I mean, it's nowhere close to the explosion we saw under Biden. So I don't want to create this false equivalency that the inflation under Trump is the same as the terrible inflation we saw under Biden. That's not true. I mean, he could get there. We'll see. But we're really not even close to that level yet. It's just something to keep an eye on. I would say, okay, inflation's a little up. We need to keep an eye on this. It's mostly driven by increased housing, shelter costs. That's one of the biggest drivers. Energy, can be a part of can be a pretty big factor in inflation costs as well. So, we'll be covering that. We'll be keeping an eye on it. It does mean that the Fed is probably going to hold off on lowering interest rates more. But back to the question about energy and their ability to access capital, it's not just reliant on the official Federal Reserve interest rates. They have kind of a different market, a different kind of access to capital that's not really relative, comparable to the average American home buyer. So I think that you could still see easier access to capital from these oil and other energy companies, even with federal interest rates staying the same.
Casey, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What was the verdict in former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan's corruption trial? What is Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton demanding from 2 Dallas area school districts? And is the housing market crashing? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at centersquare.com. Western Pennsylvanians are celebrating after the release of American history teacher Mark Fogel from a Russian labor camp in exchange for an unnamed Russian citizen. Fogel had been the focus of years of effort petitioning the U.S. government to push for his release. Legislators and family members were frustrated to see his name omitted from high-profile prisoner exchanges in 2022 and 2024. He was arrested by Russian authorities after about a half ounce of medical marijuana prescribed in the U.S. was found in his luggage in 2021. In 2024, he was deemed wrongfully detained by state officials. The Butler native made a snowy visit to the White House. On his way home, he said he felt like the luckiest man on earth right now. With a 52-48 vote Wednesday, the U.S. Senate confirmed Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence, one of the closest confirmation votes of all President Donald Trump's cabinet nominees. Gabbard, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve and former Democrat representative from Hawaii, was one of Trump's most controversial picks. As a congresswoman, Gabbard had criticized the Biden administration, saying it helped provoke Russia into invading Ukraine by publicly considering adding Ukraine to NATO. She had also supported pardoning Edward Snowden, a whistleblower who leaked classified documents about government surveillance programs. President Donald Trump this week fired all members of the boards of the military service academies, citing the infiltration of quote-unquote woke ideology. When President Joe Biden took office 4 years ago, he removed Trump appointees to the same boards. Trump had signed executive orders shutting down DEI funding and eliminating DEI staff at federal agencies, one of a flurry of orders as he trims federal spending and entanglement with progressive ideology around gender and race. Lawmakers in Washington, D.C. and in states across the country are working to ban Chinese-owned DeepSeek's AI chatbot application from government-owned devices, citing national security concerns over potential data sharing with the Chinese government. U.S. Representatives Darren LaHood, a Republican from Illinois, and Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey, introduced the No DeepSeek on Government Devices Act, which would require the Office of Management and Budget to create guidelines to remove DeepSeek from federal technologies, with exceptions for law enforcement and national security-related activities. The states of New York, Virginia, Texas, and others have already banned DeepSeek. Former national championship football coach Jim Tressel is the pick to be Ohio's next lieutenant governor. Governor Mike DeWine made the announcement Monday, selecting Tressel to replace U.S. Senator John Husted, who's filling the term of Vice President J.D. Vance. Tressel, 72, was born in Mentor, Ohio, and coached the Ohio State Buckeyes from 2001 to 2010, leading the team to a national championship in 2002 with a win over previously undefeated Miami in the Orange Bowl. Ohio State appeared in 3 national championship games under Tressel. He was confirmed by the State House and Senate on Wednesday. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. I'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the conviction of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, it's our Dan McCaleb.
Longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan is now convicted felon Michael Madigan after a jury convicted him on 10 of 23 corruption-related counts against him. Joining me to discuss this is our man in the courtroom, reporter Jim Talamonte. Jim, you were there when the verdicts were read. What was going through your head when the first guilty verdict was announced?
Yeah, it was a tense scene. I was looking at Mike Madigan, and he, as usual, had a serious look on his face, very stoic. The judge, John Robert Blakey, had warned, no outbursts in the courtroom. You wouldn't tolerate any of that. Not that you were going to get that, I think, with this crowd and in particular with these defendants. But the first count was a deadlock, and we knew going in there were going to be deadlocks on 12 out of the 29 counts total between the two defendants. But then count 2, guilty. And you just, right there, you knew, wow, here we are. This man who ran Illinois politics he was Speaker for 36 years. He was in the State House for 50, ran the Democratic Party of Illinois for 23, and was a major power broker, not just in state government, but city, Cook County. He appeared in national interviews. Mike Madigan is a guilty after all those years of seeming untouchable. And so there was tension in the courtroom, but I don't think there was shock. But at the same time, you really didn't know which way this was going to go. You just never do with a jury.
Right. Well, so there were 23 counts against Madigan. His co-defendant, Michael McLean, they were co-charged, or they were each charged with six of the same specific charges. The jury deadlocked on all 6 of those. So only Madigan was convicted, and it was on 10 charges. We can't go into every detail of each of those charges, but give our listeners some idea of what some of those charges were that he was convicted on.
Several involved ComEd, I should say. The AT&T was a deadlock count involving McClain. ComEd counts related to Madigan, even though McClain was a ComEd lobbyist, contract lobbyist for ComEd. But McClain, remember, had previously been convicted in the ComEd 4 trial on some of those related issues and crimes. And so he wasn't charged here. This was Madigan. And so Madigan was found guilty. There was bribery, there was wire fraud, unlawful use of a facility, or use of a facility for unlawful acts. And there were, I think I said wire fraud. And there was a conspiracy charge. But again, the main charges where he was found guilty were related to ComEd and related to a state board position, which was, as defense attorney, Madigan's defense attorney, Dan Collins said, this was a ruse set up by the government in essence, to find Madigan engaged in this activity to exchange, in essence, the state board position for then Chicago Alderman Daniel Solis, who was cooperating with the government, in exchange for, real estate tax business for Madigan's private law firm, where he made major money from developers, and many of those developers were brought to him by Solis and others, so that he would gain tax business as the Illinois Speaker of the House.
Now, the ComEd charges that he was convicted on, were they directly related to him getting his friends and allies jobs with ComEd?
Yes, one of the counts involved Mike Zaleski, who was a Chicago alderman, not the state rep. This is the father, Mike Zaleski, who had been an alderman, both Madigan allies, and so he was one who was receiving these payments. There was a precinct captain, Ray Nice. So some of Madigan's allies would get these payments from a contractor. There were several contractors, and so these were subcontractors, Madigan allies, who got these jobs, which they had to do either very little work or no work in exchange for these payments from ComEd. And so ComEd was doing this to curry favor with Madigan and get legislation passed. There were several pieces of legislation, you may remember, energy bills that Pat Quinn, as governor, vetoed, and Madigan and company passed those over Quinn's vetoes in 2011 and 2013. There was later the FEJA, Future Energy Jobs Act, in 2016. All of these were extremely beneficial financially to ComEd. So paying these, the sum that the prosecutors allege these Madigan allies were paid was, I think, $1.3 million, but the legislation benefit ComEd by tens of millions or more. And ComEd did, in a previous deferred prosecution agreement, pay tens of millions in fees for that deal.
And as we talked about, that the deferred prosecution agreement with ComEd and with AT&T, and the ComEd 4 previous trial that McClain was convicted, and those were not allowed to be mentioned. Right. Trial, right? Yes.
Right. Those were not mentioned. The jurors did not know that Mike McClain had been convicted in the ComEd 4 trial. And, I was thinking about, boy, how is it that McClain, who you hear on a lot more of these tapes than you heard Madigan, and who was wiretapped and who was engaged in a lot of these back and forth conversations with Danny Solis, with, Nancy Kimmy, who was a lobbyist who was trying to push the Chinatown parcel onto legislation. When that legislation got attached to a bill, State Rep Avery Bourne couldn't move her land transfer legislation, but when this parcel was added to it, all of a sudden it moved, or was going to move. It ended up not going through. So you hear McClain on all these tapes and all these recordings and emails, and yet McClain, not found guilty on any of these counts. And I wonder if, Madigan, when he took the stand, was very dismissive of McClain. They had been very close, and he said until recently. And Madigan went out of his way to be really dismissive of McClain. Did you consult Mike McClain on this? Well, as I did, as others. He was very dismissive of McClain, and I wonder if that hurt him with jurors.
And sentencing has not been scheduled yet, but Madigan does face prison time.
Thank you, Dan and Jim. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton's investigation into 2 Dallas area schools. It's Eliana Cardolo.
The Texas Attorney General's office is demanding documentation from 2 school districts over concerns that they are allowing male students to play on female sports teams in violation of state law HB 25. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what led up to these letters?
Yeah, so this is a few weeks coming. So there was an organization that maybe listeners have heard about, maybe not, called Accuracy in Media. And they're maybe the best way would be to describe kind of like an activist or advocacy organization, but they will try to hold different institutions accountable through pretense. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it. Like they'll send somebody into a situation posing as somebody else. And in this case, the Accuracy in Media sent individuals to Dallas Independent School District and Irving Independent School District. Those are both Dallas area school districts, large school districts in Texas. And they sent people into these schools who were saying that they were parents. And so in one of the organization posted videos, edited videos of these that were secretly recorded by these parents, and in quotation marks there. One of them was with the Dallas ISD's LGBT youth program coordinator named Madigan Gaston. And so she told that operative, that parent, to update a birth certificate for their transgender student in New Jersey before moving to Texas. So Gaston said, quote, "They find the loopholes in everything." And then they also filmed an interaction with Rennie Lizardo, the executive director of campus operations for Irving Independent School District. And Lizardo was told by the parents who were looking to move to the district. That's what they said. Like, hey, we're out of state. We're hoping to move to the district. We have a transgender daughter who wants to play sports. He recommended that the student get an updated birth certificate out of state and said that the district wouldn't check. And he said, quote, "It's not illegal if you don't get caught," right? So you can hear him saying that in the video. So again, this is kind of like what led up to this. It's got, I think, quite a bit of attention on social media, like X, formerly Twitter. And I think that this is maybe what ultimately got Attorney General Ken Paxton's attention in Texas there. So it's that's kind of the behind the scenes of like what led up to this. And it's pretty evident when you look at the videos in Accuracy in Media's website. And I think they posted it on social media as well. And you can kind of see what they allege happened in those videos, or, what was said. And you can, see that in that undercover video that was taken. And there's a direct correlation to what Attorney General Ken Paxton is asking about in his letters to those districts, right? So this is kind of the boiling. Sometimes you jump into a story and you're like, okay, well, like what led to this? And I think that you can do that. And so I think as a journalist, I just want to kind of preface, so put this into the discussion a little bit. As a journalist, it's like we don't operate this way. So I think Accuracy in Media, they're calling those people who are pretending to be parents journalists. And I think that there's like maybe a little bit of a distancing from that in terms of they're going somewhere under false pretenses and saying this. But they are raising these concerns about these organizations and these individuals who are in these organizations. And I think that is what got Attorney General Ken Paxton's attention.
And so what did Attorney General Ken Paxton ask from these school districts?
So it was a number of different things. So the letter, it kind of reiterated this is what was alleged to have what these individuals allegedly said. So it said, just kind of advising parents that the school district wouldn't check about the birth certificates. But specifically, his office requested documents related to training materials and policies related to the state law that bans students from playing on the sports team opposite their sex assigned at birth. So that's HB 25. And it also requested any communications, including emails, to district employees regarding the determination of a student's eligibility to participate in interscholastic sports based on sex, including the use of birth certificates or other governmental documents. It also requested an organizational chart for both districts showing where the staff or the filmed by Accuracy in Media are in the management structure in those schools. So basically, where do they fall in terms of their, like how much power do they have in that school district? And then they also sought information about the creation and funding of the Dallas Independent School District staff position, the LGBTQ plus youth program coordinator, and information related to the sports program. So specifically for the Dallas ISD, it asked for, quote, all district meeting minutes containing any discussions regarding the LGBT youth program coordinator, their role within the district or district policy as it relates to LGBT student participation in interscholastic athletic competitions. So essentially, how much sway does this position have on determining which athletes are allowed to participate in which sports? Because they're kind of looking for more information. And I think the Attorney General's office is basically wondering about how much of a policy or like an unspoken policy would exist in these kinds of school districts, and what that would mean for the different sports teams and different students there.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks, Deliana and Brendan, for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the housing market is PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, of course, you do what you do in the housing sector. Do some fine work as an economist at Zillow. And it is time, I guess, really for the housing market to crank up. It's historically been the case that, for whatever reason, like the week after the Super Bowl is kind of the opening salvo of the annual housing market. What's the state of the industry? What's your take? That's a big question. You can chip away at it as you like, and let's just have a conversation about it.
Yeah, totally. We're seeing a cool down. I think we're seeing a cool down in on the demand side for sure. New listings are slightly up from a year ago, but they're not up a lot. But inventory has ticked higher in January, and part of the reason why you'd have inventory high. Well, you think about it, if you get a big jump in the number of sellers coming on the market, even holding the demand side constant, right? Then you end up with more inventory on the market. If you have the number of sellers kind of stuck and you get a slowdown on the demand side, then you get a big increase in inventory, right?
Right.
People not buying as many homes means that homes on the market take longer to sell, they accumulate, and you get an increase in inventory. Inventory is up 19% when compared to last year.
Let me throw a perspective at you. So the mortgage producers, their trade association, they had a story that published February 6th. And the quote, basically the headline of this story was this quote from the CEO of First American Properties, Michael Isinga. And hopefully I'm not destroying Michael's last name. His quote is, "We are witnessing the biggest collapse of homebuyer demand in U.S. history. Mortgage applications have dropped by 63% since their pandemic peak, a figure that surpasses the decline seen during the 2008 financial crisis. Compared to pre-pandemic levels, applications remain down by 52%. That's a pretty big statement right there. I mean, and that tracks with what you're saying.
I think this is a little bit crazy. I think he's basically saying the market is crashing. I don't agree. I don't think the market is crashing. Yes, things have cooled down tremendously from the peak, which makes sense. You had mortgage rates. The mortgage rates are at the lowest they had ever been. Right?
Yes. And in fairness, he goes on to that the story goes on to say that. And again, this is the mortgage producers, and their point of view on this would be, they're part of the business, and it actually says the crisis has been attributed to the combination of high home prices and elevated mortgage rates during the pandemic. Low mortgage rates spurred demand, pushing prices higher. However, in today's market, those same homes have become unaffordable for many potential buyers. A home purchased for $400,000 in 2019 with a 3.5% interest rate resulted in a monthly mortgage payment of $1,796. That same home today, priced at $500,000 with a 7.26% mortgage rate, would cost $3,416, an increase of $1,600 that many households cannot afford. You and I have talked about this ongoing. I mean, the price of poker is very different right now.
We have a massive affordability strain, but I disagree to paint a doom and gloom picture. Look, mortgage rates just dropped this past week, and what did we get? We got an increase in purchase applications. right? So I think there's a couple of things to think about. The first one is we're not yet in the middle of the home shopping season. Things have slowed down a little bit because mortgage rates had been on the rise in December. And by the way, if you look at housing sales, housing sales have actually surprised on the upside, both in November and December. And which brings me to think like, hey, well, potentially people going into the new administration worried about tariffs and potentially higher interest rates may have pulled their purchases forward a little bit, which is why we may have seen the big uptick in sales in November and December. So I'm not there yet. And then at the same time, we're now seeing mortgage rates decline again, right? At the end of the month, they had been rising for most of January, and then we start to see them decline again the first week of February. And of course, the decline with lots of buyers on the sidelines waiting for their opportunity, the slight decline in mortgage rates is bringing people back in the market. So that's the picture. The picture is affordability strained for many people, waiting on the sidelines, waiting for the right opportunity, waiting for the math to add up. And when the math does add up, they jump right back in, right? And so I think that's the picture of the housing market. That's the reality of the housing market today. Another reason to dismiss claims that demand is crashing is the fact that you have builders still able to sell homes, right? It's a math problem. And yeah, I mean, you could argue demand in the pure sense of the word, right? At the current prices and mortgage rates, it's really hard to make the math add up, but buyers are there waiting in the wings. And so every time we see an increase in inventory, softening price growth, some buyers come back in. Every time we see a slight decline in mortgage rates, you see buyers come right back in. That's been the story of the housing market for the past few years.
Well, I was going to say maybe forever. I mean, and like historically, I mean, if you can afford it, you do it. And if it's really enticing, like when rates are very low,
it's very different from a global financial crisis type of market where basically you had no buyers. You had a bunch of sellers.
Yes.
You had a whole lot of sellers.
Yep.
And just no buyers. Today is completely different. We don't have a lot of sellers, and we have a lot of buyers just waiting for the opportunity to get their hands on a home.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug, on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.